our families are out here to stand in solidarity with the rest of the families, with George Floyd family. We want people to understand that we are not just quote unquote what you call protesters. We are in fact the impacted families that lost somebody. And we don't want to continue to see this keep happening in our community. And we don't want people to continue to hurt our families. And if they do hurt our families, we want them to be held accountable. We are normal human beings. We are families raising our children. They have stolen the providers in our homes. They have stolen the brothers, the uncles to our kids. And they've hurt us. And all we want is people to do the right thing, to hold these people accountable. We should not have to be out here in the blistering cold, begging, literally pleading and begging for the legislators to pass the Justin Tigans law, to pass the no-knock warrant bill, to pass the Kobe Heisler's law, to pass a law for reparations. We shouldn't have to beg and plead for that. But yet we have to do this, and it's wrong. It's wrong. We need people to get back to humanity. We need people to get back to being human beings. Just because you have never experienced something does not mean that you get to downplay the people who are actually living through this. We got legislators that don't even have to live in our communities that are making decisions for our community. We got officers that don't live in our community that come in our community and kill our loved ones and go back out to where they live in suburban Minnesota. It's not right, and it's time for people to get back to humanity. Thank you. We will now call forward the significant other of George Floyd, Courtney Ross.
Thank y'all for being out here in this cold. Today is a day in history. Our children and our grandchildren will be reading about the decision made this week by the jurors in history books. Today, the federal case against Tutow, J. Alexander King, and Thomas Lane has been sent away to the jury to deliberate whether or not they'll be found guilty of denying my love, George Floyd, his basic civil rights. My man laid on the ground with asphalt in his face and his lips, begging for help, groaning in pain, and eventually passing out from the lack of oxygen. Floyd laid still with no breath, no pulse for minutes, and the officers involved in this case did nothing to render any type of medical aid. They did not do what they were trained to do, which is lay him on his side in a recovery position. People on the street knew that Floyd needed help. Everyone who watched the video knew that Floyd needed help. And those officers, they knew that Floyd needed help too. But their excuse was that they were too cowardly to stand up to the officer in higher rank. In all my years in education, there would never be a time that I wouldn't stand up for a child, for someone who was in need, because I would be scared of the repercussions. That's not what we do as human beings. If you see someone that needs help, you help them. It is your duty when you are a public servant to help someone who needs aid. If you know CPR, if you know first aid, they tell you in those classes as a civilian, it is your duty then to render aid to someone. We have teenagers that yelled at the cops on the street that knew that. Civilians that had no training at all that could see that my man died under the knees of these men.
The last thing he saw was the pavement on the ground. The last thing I saw is his pavement being shoved into, his face being shoved into the pavement on the ground. All of our families have to live with the last moments of our loved ones being killed by the police. Not only are their lives taken that day, but so are ours. I pray this jury will do the right thing and find these officers guilty. I pray everyone finds it in their heart to go out and help when someone needs help. Thank you.
And you see how police terror impacts our community from our youth to adults. And just with Amir Locke, we just want to be clear. When community members kill each other, or so-called black on black crime, or what we call community crimes or self-hate crimes, those people are arrested, charged, and put in prison. When the police kill our families, the people who killed Hardell Sherrill, they are not in jail. They're not in prison, and a lot of them are still working. The officers who murdered Amir Locke are not in prison, have not been arrested, had not been charged. But they just announced this morning that one of the suspects they were looking for was charged in the Amir Locke case. However, the officers who had executed Amir Locke have not been charged. The officers who violated Amir Locke's civil rights have not been charged. Kim Potter, there's people we know who have done non-violent offenses who have served more time than Kim Potter. We know a lot of black men from the 80s, from the 90s, who have served 30, 40-year sentences for non-violent offenses, yet Kim Potter gets 24 months and will do probably about a year for murdering a young man, a child, who was unarmed. So, again, we want to see justice in this case. Our whole community nationwide, our civil rights have been being violated for 400 years. So that's why we want transformative legislation passed at the legislature this year. Noel Marcos' civil rights were violated. His mother is Tanya Giles. She's here. She's going to come say a few words.
Hi, my name is Tanya Giles. My son is Marcos Morales. He was 6 days into his 14th birthday when he was illegally chased by Ramsey County sheriffs, where they had thrown stop sticks, which made the car that he was a passenger in crash, killing him and his friend Elijah Thomas. As Courtney mentioned, law enforcement is supposed to protect and serve, not kill. My son sat in the car for 15 minutes screaming for his life, where there was several police officers, several sheriffs standing around. It took a resident that lived in the neighborhood hearing my son's cry for his life to come, because the police were too busy to help him, obviously. They had guns in all the other teenagers' faces and to them, while my son was trapped in the vehicle. It's one thing that I have to go the rest of my life without my son, and my family has to live their life without their brother, my grandkids without their uncle, but by the hands of law enforcement, the people who are supposed to protect and serve us. And then for them to just walk away like it's nothing, and then to ridicule our loved ones that are deceased and put them out to be these awful people who deserve death. You know how many comments I get about, oh, well, maybe your kids shouldn't have been this, maybe you should be a better parent, maybe you should do, you know what? I was the best parent I knew how to be, and I taught my kids right from wrong. No kid deserves to die for being a passenger in a car, for walking down the street, for sleeping on a couch that the police have idea that there's a wanted person in the house, for a person that had a counterfeit 20 they're not even sure of going to a store. People should not have to die for these simple things, and the reason it keeps happening is because nobody is doing anything about it. They keep getting away with it, so why should they stop? My life, these families' lives have been so turned around inside out. My life will never be the same. These people's lives will never be the same. We have to live every day without the person that we love. Our families have to live that. Our community has to live that. It's unfair. Something needs to happen, and happen soon, because it's gotten way out of hand. Every other day you're hearing about law enforcement killing somebody getting it, and nothing's happening. And it's devastating. Imagine yourself without somebody you love very, very much, a child, a mother, a brother, an uncle, a nephew. It's the worst experience to have to live through. And at the hands of law enforcement, it even makes it that much worse. Thank you.
We will now call forward the president of the Minnesota Justice Coalition, Jonathan McCollum.
Hello, my name is Jonathan McClellan. I'm president of the Minnesota Justice Coalition. We are part of a collective of organizations that work with families and community to draft and advance legislation and other policy initiatives at the Capitol here in St. Paul and in Washington, D.C. A lot of people want an illusion because the reality just can't be. But on May 25th, 2020, that reality was shattered. And here we are awakening to conscience and still fighting to get that boot off our neck. Today, on the eclipse of a civil rights trial, one in which Derek Chauvin has already pled guilty, the others failed to accept their role in the murder of George Floyd. Derek Chauvin violated the public trust and showed a blatant disregard for human life. The results of his brutality and the complicity of his co-conspirators have caused immense damage to our community, primarily of color, and broken its most sacred capital, the public's trust. Further, this incident has sparked outrage around the world. The sentence of the court of 22 and a half years was a good start, but we feel it did not reach far enough. Derek should be serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. This trial is not about what the three officers did. It is about what they failed to do. This trial is about George Floyd's constitutional rights, due process, his inability to get medical attention, and the blatant disregard from these former officers to see the humanity in George Floyd. We know Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck, depriving him of life. Jay Alexander stood behind Derek Chauvin and failed to do anything, while Thomas Lane held down George Floyd's legs. Tu Tao claims he attempted to control the crowd on the street, but watched and did nothing to help keep George Floyd alive, despite his pleas. These three officers each had a role in what Derek Chauvin was doing as he knelt on George Floyd's neck. We call that aiding and abetting. They need to be held accountable for how they failed to behave as law enforcement, as they stood by while George Floyd was deprived of his basic human rights. These officers could have saved George Floyd's life, which makes them guilty as Derek Chauvin. These officers failed in their most basic duty to protect and serve. Instead, they collectively committed murder. They should be found guilty, guilty, guilty as accessories to murder, period. Thank you.
We will now call forward Tamara from the Center of Victims of Torture. We do believe that George Floyd was tortured that day that he laid on that ground, and the officers were the only ones, those other 3 officers right in that building were the only ones that could have helped George Floyd. The other civilians could have possibly been murdered themselves or injured if they would have tried to save George Floyd. So the only ones that had enough authority to try to at least tap Derek Chauvin on the shoulders and say, come on man, get off of him. Those were the 3 officers that refused to do that day. No one seen them stop to say, hey, could you get off of him to try to at least save his life. So we believe that George Floyd was simply tortured along with the rest of our loved ones. Justin Tigan was tortured when they threw him in the dumpster and beat him to death. Hardell Sherrill was tortured when they let him die on the ground. So we have this group that have joined forces with our families and with our group. We will now call for Tamara. Thank you.
Hello everybody, good afternoon. My name is Tamara Hill. I'm here on behalf of the Center for Victims of Torture, where I serve as a policy advocate. At CVT, we provide direct services, healing, and advocacy on behalf of those that have been tortured internationally or here in the United States. So our principles of healing and our fight against torture also serve our families in the Twin Cities and Greater Minnesota. I'm here today to support these families and support any family in the Twin Cities that has lost a family member or a loved one to police violence, who has had their life stolen from them and their life turned upside down. At CVT, we focus on advocating for these issues and supporting these families and asking the legal system to hold up to when it calls itself a justice system. If the criminal legal system wants to call itself a justice system, it has to hold to the strongest values of what justice are, which include accountability. And on behalf of CUT and these families, we're asking for accountability today and for justice to be upheld for people who have had their lives stolen from them. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Thanks a lot, you guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.